With all the technologies our cameras are crammed with these days, it's easier than ever to manually set your exposure. Welcome to Look, Think, Click. As I mentioned in the last vlog, the easiest way to set your exposure manually is to use the camera's monitor. That's if your camera has this feature. Many cameras do these days because it is so easy to set your camera manually just looking at your monitor. If your monitor's changing as you're changing your shutter speed and your aperture settings, then you know you're able to do this. If you're changing the settings and your monitor's not changing its brightness value, then it's not enabled. Your camera doesn't have this feature. But if it does, learn to use it. It makes it way easier. You can see what's happening as you change your shutter speed, as you change your aperture settings, and this will be displayed on the monitor. So you can clearly see what parts of your photograph will be exposed well, what parts will be too bright, and what parts will be too dark. If it's a high contrast situation, you've got the option to dial your settings one way or the other and expose for the highlights or the shadow areas and see what's going on in those parts of the image. If your camera doesn't have this feature enabled on your monitor, it will have an exposure meter readout to tell you how much light is entering the camera and what your exposure needs to be set at. On one side it'll have a plus, the other side it'll have a minus usually, and a row of dots or some form of indicator to show you whether you're underexposing or overexposing and when it's correctly exposed. And of course you want to aim for that correct exposure. But it depends on how your metering is set. Most modern cameras have different options to set your exposure meter. Averaged is probably the most popular default, where the camera will take an average reading from across the whole frame and calculate the correct exposure. I use this frequently, and then I also use the spot meter, and I can quickly shift between the two to get a more accurate reading, particularly in high contrast situations. I'll want to take a spot meter reading from one particular part of the image, like I have done with the face of the Buddha statue here. I wanted to really exaggerate the contrast. This was shot at about 2 o'clock on a sunny day, and I've taken the light meter reading just from the forehead of the statue and slightly underexposed to accentuate the contrast. On a cloudy day, the same statue, flat lighting, a lot more boring, and just an average light meter reading worked fine. So in strong contrasting light situations, using your spot meter is invaluable and great tool to learn to use it well. Most cameras also have a center weighted setting on the light meter, and this dates back to days past when there was no options to change, that most cameras only had this option. I don't find it particularly useful unless you're inclined to center your subject in your frame all of the time, which I don't recommend. It makes for kind of boring pictures. The other things that you can use to help you gauge your exposure are the histogram and the blinkies. And these two things are good to use if you're technically minded, and if you're not, then don't worry too much about them. The histogram and the blinkies will show you what's really overexposed and when there's going to be no detail left in the highlights, and what's going to be really underexposed and where there's going to be no detail left in the shadow areas. Many times I've read that it's ideal to have a nice bell-shaped histogram curve. I don't believe this at all. There's going to be lots of situations where you won't get a bell-shaped curve, but you'll still have a really nicely exposed image. In my Buddha statue face picture, for example. So the histogram and the blinkies are great tools to use, but don't rely on them to gauge your exposure. Great for a technical reference, but not for measuring your exposure with. So be encouraged. Practice using your exposure meter. Check out the different settings, check out the different options you've got available, Use your camera's monitor if you've got that option available. It makes it way easier, and enjoy shooting lots of pictures. Next vlog, I'll talk more about exposure setting and seeing the light and why it's important to really take notice of the light. Please do subscribe to our YouTube channel. We've got lots of great videos up there already, and there's more on the way.